story is turning out to be a pretty interesting story. So one day I opened my email and I had an email from Patrick Dunphy. Patrick is with the Hood, and he put a little bit in there about a portrait of Daniel Webster that had been in his family, and his cousin Will was looking for a home for the portrait. And threw in that they had a Monroe portrait that went to the Monroe Library in Virginia. And so I felt like, wow, our little historical society getting something like that, that's pretty good. So I took it to the board of directors, and in their wisdom, they agreed to accept it. And then the story got really interesting. So some of our docents were in here, were thinking about where to hang it. Patrick was very helpful with that. In the midst of this, Patrick and I realized we had a number of connections, family connections, including our son vacationing with his mom. And he is Deborah Grable's brother. So Patrick and I worked together and decided to take what we now call old Daniel from here and hang new Daniel. And one of the benefits of that is if you're standing there, you can see young and old Daniel at the same time. So we had some fun going around the house and getting things together, and then organized a time for Will to bring the painting from Boston. I learned so much about the care of art, the transport of art. The curators at the Hood are so helpful in telling us about the environment for art. So we had our delivery, and today I said to Will, well, you stirred up kind of a hornet's nest by giving us this, a good one. But the day of delivery, a bad hornet's nest was stirred up on the outside of the building in an old alarm box. And so here we are with this precious cargo, and hornets everywhere. We got stung. The college responded. It was like calling the Ghostbusters. They got out with all kinds of stuff and took care of us. At that time, I tied these curtains up in knots to let more light in. And for the first time, someone, the president of the Historical Society, Cindy, saw an obscure signature in the corner. And that's where the story really took off. I felt like I had done my job. Things were safely hung. The walls were intact. Over to you. And then Cindy, together with Laura, an art historian, I got to see the historians in action. And I would liken it very much to my career in healthcare and science, where you have a hypothesis and then you research it. And if it's a dead end, you back up. You form another hypothesis and you go down that road. It has been so fascinating to watch that process unfold. And I will then turn it over to those in the know about the historical value of this painting.
Well, I don't think we're at the value level yet, but I'd love to hear from Will sort of how Daniel got here. Are you okay to jump in?
Sure,
okay.
Sure. I'm Will Dunphy. I live in Boston in a neighborhood called Jamaica Plain. And I realized driving up here today that this is a deeply personal story and also a family story. But my wife warned me not to tell a long Irish story, but here I go anyway. Well, first of all, the painting, as you probably all know, hung in the Parker House, the oldest continuously operating hotel in the country. And the Parker House is situated at the juncture of School and Tremont Streets in downtown Boston. And through some of the research that Laura has done, I learned that the painting actually hung initially, or at least as far back as we can go, at another hotel nearby called the Young's Hotel, which used to be on Court Street, which is only like a block and a half away from the Parker House. And the owner of both hotels was the same man with the last name of Whipple. And when he closed down Young's Hotel, a number of paintings migrated from the Young's Hotel, now closed, to the Parker House. And as far as we know, this particular portrait of Webster has been hanging in the new Parker House, the new building, since 1927, but actually it had been on that site since maybe sometime in the 1880s or 1890s. Now I want to jump ahead. In the late 1960s, my uncles, including Patrick's father, Walter Dunphy, purchased the Parker House and owned and managed the Parker House for a number of years. And at the time, the Parker House was in pretty dilapidated condition. And downtown Boston in the late 60s, early 70s is not the way it is now. Now it's a thriving, very dilapidated, seedy, and I won't go into stories, but the challenge to the Dunphy brothers was to bring the Parker House back to its glory days. And it was a challenge. At the same time, my father and mother moved into the Parker House and lived there from 1969 to 1989. So they lived in the hotel in a small apartment in the Parker House for those 20 years. So it's a deeply personal story because I would go to the Parker House a couple times a week. And during the 70s, my children were born, and their parents lived in the hotel. And it was an incredible experience for them visiting there. And my oldest, Elizabeth, thought of herself as Eloise. And actually, this book, which was published last year about the Parker House, or maybe a couple of years ago by Susan Wilson, when I asked Susan to sign copies for my children, and I told her the story of my daughter Beth, she signed it to Eloise, to Eloise Dunphy. At some point in the 1970s, the hotel had been renovated a couple different times. And because we lived close by, my father would occasionally say, would you like some old furniture? And that's how we furnished our house. Because we had a 15-room house and not all that much money. And we would take the cast-off furniture of the hotel, some of which I still have, and decorate our house, furnish our house. But at one juncture, probably around 75 or 76, the hotel was being renovated. I was in for dinner with my parents, and my father said, there's a room upstairs and I want to take you up there because whenever renovations occur, artifacts and the like begin to disappear. So this particular painting disappeared into my home. So we went up, and there were two portraits that my brother and I were interested in. One was of President Monroe, and the other was of Daniel Webster, this painting. But there were some other objects as well. And initially, my brother had this painting, and my brother is a very funny person. And he calls this portrait Traveling Dan because he was a young man then, and he left Boston and he went to the West Coast. And as he said, he brought a suitcase and two paintings, one of Monroe and one of Daniel Webster. And so Daniel Webster has traveled to San Francisco and also to Seattle. But when my brother returned to Boston, he handed over the two portraits to me, and they've been in my house since roughly 1979 or so. So we sold our house this summer, And I had already found a beautiful home for the Monroe portrait, and I was looking for a home for this portrait as well. And I reached out to my cousin Patrick, knowing that he was here at the Hood for some assistance, and he took it from there. The portrait I originally saw when it was hanging in the dining room of the hotel, which is just off the lobby. Today the restaurant for many years, most years, has been called Parker's. And so that was my initial recollection, but I questioned it until last night I got out this book called Boston in the Parker House, which was published in 1927. And it does align with what you've learned and what Susan Wilson had told us, Susan Wilson being the historian of the Parker House. The Parker House may be the only hotel in the country that has a historian and has a little museum. So that's pretty neat.
Parker House roll.
And Parker House rolls and so on. So I took out this book, which had been given to me by a friend many years ago, and I was thumbing through it, and I came to this passage near the end, which is relevant. The portraits in oils of famous Americans, which used to hang in Young's Hotel, Young's Hotel closing roughly in the 1880s, are hung on the panels of the lobby and the main dining room. So this was one of, I believe, 6 portraits. I can only account for the 2. It's been hanging initially on our staircase, coming down from the 2nd floor to the 1st floor of our late Victorian house, and then for many, many years in our dining room. And I want to end by just telling you 2 little things about the portrait. One is that I have 3 children. My youngest is named Kevin. And when he was maybe 3 or 4 years old, this would be like 1982 or so, we noticed when he came down the staircase and he would be passing Daniel Webster, he'd always have his head averted. And we wondered why that was. And when we asked him, he said, "Look at the eyes, look at the eyes." And he was...
I just thought it was a Democrat.
No. So we associate the portrait with Kevin for sure, who grew up to be an artist, by the way, kind of like his cousin here.
Right, and he packed this for you.
Yeah.
So he had his, he had to come to terms with it.
He did. He came to terms with it and became an artist himself. And then lastly, as I was telling a few of you, we'd been in this house for 44 years and we sold it in July. And we sold it to this wonderful couple who were living nearby in Jamaica Plain and also have 3 children. And in their formal offer, which we accepted, they had included one stipulation or one request. We love the portrait in the dining room, and we respectfully ask whether or not the portrait could be included in the sale of the house. And so my wife and I responded, "We accept your offer for the house, but the portrait is going elsewhere."
Thank you.
Yes, so there you are.